Bibliophiles of the internet. As of November 22nd, this channel will have existed for 12 entire years, and I thought I would celebrate my 12th booktube anniversary by picking my favorite new releases from the past 12 years. I'm someone who's always done a pretty good job of keeping up with new releases and recent releases every single year. Of course, I do mix in a lot of backlist titles in there as well, but for the sake of this video, a new release is any book of any genre or age demographic that was published within the year we're talking about. So for example, if I dial it back to 2013 when I first started this booktube channel, I can only choose a book that was published for the first time in 2013. I don't have to have read it in the year it was originally published for it to count, but I do have to have read it for obvious reasons. So that's the idea. I think you'll catch on as we go, and I don't think I'll be giving full synopses for each and every one of these books. It's more of an opportunity for me to gush over some all-time faves and just reminisce. Although in true Libra fashion, I might have some honorable mentions mixed in there as well. Let's just get into this deeply subjective, deeply correct, at least to me, list. Dialing the clock all the way back to 2013, I would say that the most memorable new release from 2013, at least for me, was Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. I daydream about rereading this trilogy all the time. I think about it all the time. I have deep sensory memories about where I was, what I was wearing, what the weather was like, what I was feeling when I first read this book. I think because this is a sci-fi series that is experimental in some ways, a lot of people assume that it requires a lot of work and a lot of brain power to truly understand and appreciate, but I actually think it's a lot quieter and a lot more straightforward than you might think. In the simplest terms, this is a sci-fi story about a sentient spaceship named Breck who has thousands of connected minds and bodies that used to serve this all-powerful galactic empire, but something happened and now her consciousness only exists in one frail human body, and all she remembers is that she desperately wants revenge on the empire. Again, because Breck is just one piece of a sentient spaceship connected to an entire network of intelligence and consciousness, but now solely existing in one body, the way she sees the world and interacts with the people around her is so unique. The trilogy consistently plays with perspective in really fascinating ways, and if you want to read a trilogy about a former soldier slowly growing an anti-imperial conscience and exacting revenge on an evil empire, you can't get much better than this. I do want to give an honorable mention right off the bat to Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, which was also published in 2013. It's an absolutely phenomenal collection of essays, not only extolling the importance of indigenous science, but sharing ideas about how we can heal our relationship with nature and foster a connection of reciprocity with the earth itself. I consider this to be essential reading from an absolutely essential voice. Moving on to 2014, my favorite new release from that year was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is a literary fiction story about a Chinese-American family living in small-town Ohio in the 1970s, and one day the eldest daughter, Lydia, is found dead, and her body is recovered from a nearby lake. This, of course, throws the entire family and the entire community into chaos, and you get POVs from all the family members, including flashbacks from Lydia herself, as they try to make sense of what exactly happened, why this happened to Lydia, and most importantly, what this says about their family. I was actually assigned this book as part of the curriculum for an Asian American lit class that I took, and it was far and away one of the best things we read in that class. It's such a masterclass in imagery and metaphor alone that I was able to write like a 10-page paper on how the way eggs are used throughout this story as an image speaks to the characterization and internal struggle for all of the main characters. So that's how deep I was in the minutia of this story, and to this day I still think it's a modern masterpiece. The best new release from 2015 is absolutely no contest. It has to be The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. There simply is no other viable choice. I don't even know what there is to say that hasn't already been said. This is one of the best books and one of the best trilogies that has ever been written or possibly will ever be written, and I often marvel at the fact that I was able to witness each book in this series as they came out in real time, and that I'm even sharing the same timeline as N.K. Jemisin and this series. If you live under a rock, no pun intended, The Fifth Season is the first book in a sci-fantasy series where there are people known as Orojins who can control the movements of the earth, and because they have this power, they are severely oppressed and seen as dangerous. The main character is an Orojin, and when the story begins, her daughter has just been kidnapped, and she's set on a journey to try and get her back. I don't need or want to say anything more than that. Again, N.K. Jemisin is one of the greatest writers of our time, and what she was able to accomplish in this trilogy just defies words. I do have to give an honorable mention to one of my all-time favorite books, The Gods of Tango by Quero de Roberto, Get This, which also came out in 2015. Even though I wouldn't discover it for a few more years as a trans-masked Latina person, that book radically changed my life. If you love stories about musicians, if you love queer history and queer historical fiction, you need to read this. Continuing with my list of what I consider to be genre essentials, basically, the best new release from 2016, in my opinion, was Nine Fox Gambit by Yoon Ha Lee. This is another sci-fi series starter that I think to this day gets a really bad rap for being quote-unquote too complicated, when it's actually incredibly character-driven and often takes a small-scale look at a vastly complex, bigger picture, and I think very effectively works towards connecting those dots. The story follows Captain Calchetes, a disgraced officer who's recently been demoted for her unconventional tactics, but if she can retake the Fortress of Scattered Needles from the heretics, she could not only redeem herself, but possibly save the Hexarchate itself. Her best chance of retaking the fortress is to ally with an undead tactician named Shuos Jideo, who on one hand has never once lost a battle, but was also famous for massacring 2 armies in his first life, including his own. Again, this series definitely does have big, complex ideas about intergalactic warfare, mathematical weaponry, and societal divisions, but I also consistently found each book to be so incredibly human at its heart. There's also elements of possession in some ways, with Cheris and Jidao sharing the same body. There's a trans allegory to be made there as well, since 2 people of different genders are sharing that same body. If any of that appeals to you on any level, my advice is to ignore the noise and just give this series a chance. I do want to quickly shout out Shelter by Jung Yun, which is also published in 2016. It's sort of a literary thriller about a Korean-American man named Kyung who's been living beyond his means for quite some time, and even though he and his wife's debt is catching up with them and threatening the life they want to provide for their son, he still refuses to ask his well-off parents for any kind of assistance. But then his parents find themselves the victims of a violent home invasion, and suddenly the dynamic changes. Kyung and his wife find that taking in Kyung's parents is really their only choice, and being forced to live under the same roof again causes a lot of Kyung's feelings about his childhood to resurface. This is a quieter, more subtle story, but it's also deeply emotional and intense. I read it 9 years ago now, and I am still feeling its impacts. The choices are getting tougher as we approach the 2020s, but I have to say, for me, the best new release of 2017 would have to be Peter Darling by S.A. Chant. This is a queer indie fantasy romance and fairy tale retelling. It's a trans twist on Peter Pan, where Peter is actually a trans man who was raised as Wendy Darling, but ran away to Neverland where he could be his true self. He actually tries to go back home where he's forced to live as his old self, and he realizes that he can no longer be that person or live in that way. So even though he's much older, he decides to return to Neverland and finds that a lot has changed in his absence. I will never be able to say enough good things about this book. It puts such a powerful exclamation point on the fact that trans people can and should exist without owing anyone anything, simply for the joy of existing for ourselves. And it also has a lot to say about how safe spaces can't be considered truly safe if they don't allow you to fully express yourself and if they don't afford you the space to continue evolving and growing. Listen, I have to give 2 honorable mentions for this year. First to Elmet by Fiona Mosley, which is a quiet pastoral novel about a boy named Daniel whose father is determined to raise Daniel and his sister far away from the reaches of society. They live in this cabin in the woods, they hunt and forage off the land, and eventually some greedy locals begin to threaten their way of life. I think about my experience listening to this audiobook all the time. It is, in a word, fantastic. My second honorable mention for 2017 has to be In Other Lands by Sarah Rees Brennan. It's such a zany and delightful satirical take on your classic Portal fantasy story about this super messy bisexual nerd named Elliot who stumbles into a fantasy school in a fantasy world. But he doesn't want to be trained to become a warrior like everyone else. He wants to become a liaison who brokers peace treaties with the various species. I have read this book many, many times over the years, and it makes me laugh and brings me joy every single time as if it's the very first time. 2018 was another year where my brand made the choice very obvious for me, so I had to go with The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Quesada. This is a woefully underread and underrated book that I talk about all the time. It's a fictional take on queer Latina history that is rendered so beautifully and so thoughtfully. If a fictional story about the very real founding of the first ever all-Latina house on the Harlem drag scene appeals to you, I cannot recommend this one enough. For the year 2019, I had to go with a book that I actually read fairly recently that totally rocked my world. That would be Video Games Have Always Been Queer by Bo Ruberg. This was published from an academic press in 2019. Bo Ruberg is a professor of game theory and gender theory and is really pioneering a field of study at the intersection of those things. In this collection of nonfiction essays, the author is arguing that queerness in video games can be both observed and engaged with beyond the question of whether a queer identity is simply written into a game's story or its mechanics. It's a book that really encourages reading video games queerly and activating queer modes of play in regards to how we engage with video games of all kinds. I said as much in my September wrap-up, but as a queer gamer myself, this book really unlocked my world and gave me new language and newfound appreciation for how and why queerness is an integral and not insubstantial piece of what makes video games as a medium so incredibly worthwhile. This is another one I cannot recommend highly enough. 2020 was certainly a year, capital A, capital Y, but I have a feeling you know which 2020 release I think is far and away the best, so feel free to say it with me. It's obviously Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. Not only do I think this is a no-notes perfect story that strikes the perfect balance of cultural mythology and magic, mystery, humor, romance, and heart, but as a trans-masc Latina person myself, it has also tangibly changed my life for the better in so many ways. So I simply could not have chosen anything else. I do have an honorable mention to give to Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, which is so innovative, so outside the box, so fascinating. It's told through TV scripts about this actor who continuously plays the role of generic Asian man in every project he books, and it's about how he aspires to break out of that stereotype someday. I think this book is so sharp and so smart. I actually read Charles's book, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, as part of that same course where I read Everything I Never Told You, and it really blew me away. So to see Charles finally get his flowers with Interior Chinatown also made this an incredibly memorable release. I feel like I'm just going to keep saying variations of this as we go on from this point, but 2021 was a really incredible year for new releases. It was really hard to narrow down, but I think I have to give this one to No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbull. The third and final installment in this trilogy actually just came out in September. I am definitely not caught up, but I really do want to get there sooner than later. But this trilogy is an interesting blend of sci-fi, fantasy, and even horror. It begins with a young woman named Lena whose brother's death at the hands of police was unfortunately televised, and the incident went viral because it revealed to the world that monsters do in fact exist. This kind of throws a wrench into society in all the ways you would expect, and this first book is a really unforgettable exploration of how increasingly fear is something that we have to learn to walk hand in hand with, and also that so much of our world is governed by unspoken social contracts, and one of those contracts is that we do actually have a responsibility to each other whether we realize it or not. Honorable mentions to Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee for being the absolutely badass conclusion to one of the best fantasy series of the 21st century, hands down, and also to In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens, the first book I ever read from F.T. Lukens, and also a book that I buddy read with three very close friends of mine, which also made it a very special experience. 2022 was another year where the selection basically made itself. I told myself that whatever year this book was first published in, it would undoubtedly reign supreme over any other new release that year. So for that reason, I think the best book published in 2022 was The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is truly a once-in-a-lifetime, possibly once-in-a-generation type of story. It's a queer epic fantasy that's essentially about two young warriors shepherding an ancient god across a deeply broken land in hopes of freeing the kingdom from generations of suffering and oppression. The story is told over the course of this 5-day pilgrimage, and it's also structured in such a way that it mimics forms of oral storytelling in ways that are both traditional and modern, and also incredibly expansive. I've said this about this book so many times in so many ways, but underneath all the incredibly successful craft elements, the story is truly a testament to how the future is always worth fighting for, even if, and I would argue especially when, we don't even know what the future might hold. Everything you've heard about this book is absolutely correct, and it's also so much more than you think. Again, if you've been here for a second, if you know anything about my brand, you know that the very first book I read in 2023 never once lost its grip on me as the year proceeded and more new books came out. It never once strayed from that top spot, and it still holds a very special place in my heart to this day, no pun intended. That book is, of course, The World and All That It Holds by Alexander Hamon. Listen, before you write this off as just another dry war book, trust me when I say this book is a heart-wrencher, and it's absolutely magnificent and triumphant. triumphant. The story begins in Sarajevo in 1914, where our main character, Rafael Pinto, actually witnesses the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Obviously, this was one of the key events that put World War I into motion, and even though Pinto wants nothing more than to stay home and work the pharmacy he inherited from his father, he is drafted into the war, and there he ends up falling in love with one of his fellow soldiers. This is one of those stories that's written in such a way that it makes you acutely aware of the miracle of your own existence. It's electrifying, it's soul-filling in ways that I can't even really describe. In the simplest terms, this is a story about finding love at what seems like the end of the world, fighting to hold on to that love, trying to hold on to the version of yourself revealed by that love, and searching for a safe place where that love can exist, even if it's only ever in your heart. Despite the bleak, inciting incidents of this story, it's full of so much life, so much hope, and so much love. I've been begging people to read this book for years, and I will happily continue to do so. I do have to insert an honorable mention here for the masterpiece that is Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, an unflinching social commentary that makes the life and death stakes of the prison industrial complex into a literal gladiator-style tournament. When we think about fiction that extols the dangers of the private prison system and the need for abolishing the prison system entirely, this book is both the frontrunner and the blueprint. And lastly, for this past year, 2024, it was nearly impossible to narrow things down once again, but the 2024 release I still think about to this day is Fire Exit by Morgan Talty. Morgan Talty is one of my absolute favorite authors. This was his debut full-length novel about an indigenous man named Charles who lives across the river from the Penobscot Reservation in Maine, and he's forced to watch his estranged daughter grow up without him in her life. Because of blood quantum law, he and his daughter's mother decided that he would not legally claim his daughter as his child because then she would not have any legal claim to her native status. So Charles has kept this secret for many years, and he's also having to navigate being the sole caretaker for his mother with dementia. And eventually all that emotional stress leads him to decide that he is no longer interested in keeping this secret from his child. This is a truly sensational debut that absolutely flew under the radar. It's quiet in a lot of ways, but it's also cutting and extremely insightful. And I think it makes a really powerful statement about how when we think about history and the claiming of our own history, that means we have to claim both the good parts and also the deeply uncomfortable parts. It's very much a story about how history is something that we create together as family, as a community. It's a never-ending project of reconciling conflicting truths and experiences and just learning how to live in that dissonance. Again, it's kind of a subtle story on the surface, but I also think it's something incredibly special. I do have to give out my last two honorable mentions to, firstly, The Other Olympians by Michael Waters. This is an incredibly informative and worthwhile history of previously uncelebrated queer, trans, and intersex professional athletes throughout history. And it's equally about the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and how that overlapped with the 1936 Berlin Olympics and really opened the doors to methods of gender surveillance that we are still contending with to this day. If you, like me, are absolutely furious about the Olympic Committee's recent statements about policing access to the upcoming Olympic Games when it comes to trans athletes and also female athletes whose bodies naturally create higher levels of testosterone, definitely read this book to learn about the origins of those policies. The other 2024 release that really gave me pause when considering which title would be considered the best, at least for me, was The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. The wild thing is that I do not have any interest in anything else Lev Grossman has ever published, but if you tell me a book is an innovative medieval reimagining of the legend of King Arthur, I'm gonna bite. And I do genuinely think this is one of those lightning in a bottle stories that absolutely earns every single one of its 673 pages, which again, is not a thing I ever thought I would say. If you asked me which books I would give anything to read again for the very first time, this would absolutely be on my list. The experience of immersing myself in this offbeat yet intensely earnest medieval adventure was so distinctive and so memorable that I would absolutely do it again in a heartbeat. So those are the best 12 new releases of the past 12 years, in my very humble opinion, of course with some honorable mentions sprinkled in as well. Again, these are my very deeply subjective selections. If you have any standout books that you think characterize a specific year, I would love to hear all about them down below in the comments. Whether this was your first or 50th time joining me here on the channel, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.